Hello, I'm so excited to have you join us for the first edition, first episode of Parson'S Porch. Today with my very special guest, my friend and brother, distinguished pastor and minister in the city of Chicago, Pastor Jarvis HANSON of the New Nazareth Baptist Church. Thank you so much for joining us, Pastor HANSON. We are excited to have you here today. I could not think of a greater, more informed individual to have with us today. And just let me begin with our audience by suggesting that I'm excited to have this opportunity. I am Pastor Donald Parsons. I have been a preacher, a minister, a deliverer, interpreter, translator of the gospel for over 60 some years. Been pastoring since the age of 19, and now, I shouldn't tell you, 78 years old. And so I'm just excited to still be waking up, but I'm more excited to be able to share with you some critical information that I think is going to be impactful in the future for you and for those you share this information with. I want you to right now get busy. Share, call, antagonize someone and tell them, would you believe Pastor Parson has a video podcast on WBTC?
Awesome.
And you need to be a part of it. We're having a great discussion today, and you're going to be informed, you're going to be motivated. I expect to have a very intelligent guests who are going to share with you information that's going to be a difference maker in your life, a viewpoint, a perspective that is not often shared, will be shared by pastors, distinguished community leaders, some in-tune politicians, other people, authors who are making a difference in the community, but specifically in the community within the framework of the spiritual and the religious context, which is our concern. So today we're beginning in celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday and his own celebration this past weekend and on Monday and over the weekend. We're talking about the letter from the Birmingham jail today, its impact. What should we be saying about it? Should we still be talking about it? And what difference has it made? And I couldn't think of a better person than Pastor HANSON to have come. He's an influential pastor. He leads the pastors. He's the co-founder of a group of younger pastors who are seeking to make a difference, the Charisma Group. He's also now a leader in our National Baptist USA Convention movement. And I couldn't think of a better person to have share with us and to talk about the relevance, the impact, and what we can expect in the future from the church and from people who are going to be really giving leadership to our religious community in Chicago and around the nation over the next 25 to 30 or 40 years. And so that's why we're here, and that's why Dr. HANSON is my guest. So, once again, welcome, man. I'm so glad to have you. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
On this show today. And I want to thank WVTC for making this outlet available.
Amen.
And for giving somebody like me an opportunity to share my perspective, which is usually kind of different from that one that other people tend to have. But I am convinced that you and I are going to have a great relationship over the months and years to come through this podcast. We're going to get to be great friends. I love talking to people, as you can tell. Now, my concern regarding the letter from the Birmingham jail really has to do with the idea, one, that King has a Chicago connection. He moved his family and his kids to the west side of Chicago over on Hamlin Avenue. back in the 60s and started a movement. So his reception in Chicago, matter of fact, that was in 1966, I believe. It was in 66.
So you remember that vividly?
I do remember it because I remember the march down Garfield Boulevard across Cicero Avenue. At that point, Western was kind of a racial demarcation line. In the 60s, people who looked like us did not go across Western after dark.
I've heard that.
Well, I lived during that time, and so it's a fact. And he was assailed with bricks. He was met with a whole lot of hostility and resistance by the community in Market Park and marching across for open housing during that time, which was the real focus. And so he has a real connection to Chicago. And one of my vivid memories was being in a church for a meeting on a Monday afternoon for the ministers' conference in Chicago on the south side of Chicago. The church was, the pastor was B.F. Paxton. True Light Baptist Church. See, I forgot, I was a teenager at this time. And I was at the meeting with one of my older pastor friends, Pastor Curtis Melson, who was pastoring out in Chicago Heights. And the president of the ministers' conference wanted to invite Martin Luther King when he came back to Chicago to speak at the conference. The pastor was such an ally of Mayor Daley that he went to his office and retrieved his sawed-off shotgun and came back to the pulpit and asked all of us to leave the building. I was in the building at that time, and that was some of the hostility that Martin Luther King received from African-American clergy in Chicago. It happened in 1966.
And you were at that meeting.
I was present at that meeting, and I was 19 years old.
Doc, just to hear you say that you had that meeting, I've heard that story so many times, but I never heard someone talk about it. That was
I was present.
And
I left out with the other ministers who decided that it was time to go because this pastor went and got his shotgun and said, we're not going to have Martin Luther King talk even or discuss him coming to the conference if the conference was going to keep on meeting at his church on Mondays.
No deliberation on that.
No deliberation. And so we left. So that's what brought me to this discussion of the letter, because there is a real Chicago Martin King connection that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And I guess my first question would be, what kind of reception do you think King would receive today if he came to Chicago?
That's a great question. I think that it would be a little bit more warmly welcome, but you still have some of those past, undertones of feelings in those days. Now I was in reading the letter again, and then just hearing him speak about it. I went on YouTube and heard him actually read it. And one of his concerns was the fact that some of the churches were silent, and they were more concerned about order and waiting and not actually confronting the challenges that faced and plagued the people of that day. And so with that being said, I think we still would have some of those different challenges today if he were here with us. Some would welcome it, but I think some would be a little bit more, apprehensive, if I could say that.
Okay. I probably am not quite as optimistic about the reception he received, because I guess I tend to look at the kind of support that the organizations that Dr. King founded, was associated with, was connected with by his own blood, by demonstrations of financial support, has not been great since his death. And so when I look at organizations in the city that continue to suffer for support from religious organizations and churches, we're almost looking at Operation Push and Rainbow appears to be on intensive care, in the hospital of the culture.
Yeah.
And so that says, if we had appreciation or true respect, I think, for King, well, then I think that what he represented and what he supported should be different. And my frustration has always been that King was not a lay person. He was an ordained minister of the gospel.
Yes, sir.
He was a trained minister of the gospel. He was intellectual and spiritual. He was a leader. He was a fellow pastor.
Yes, sir.
And to not be accepted as one, or he's not really viewed even through the lens of the minister's perspective, when in my own conversations, he's still viewed as, quote unquote, a civil rights leader.
Yeah, yeah.
As opposed to being a theologian whose doctrine and whose advocacy was totally biblically based.
Yeah, there was no separation. All of it was together. And you absolutely right. We tend to separate civil rights from the Christendom, when really, in essence, you can't talk about civil rights or Christianity without talking about civil rights together, and we try to divorce the two.
Well, we do. And I think that's, it's problematic. But I was concerned with, I wonder what would the reception be like.
Yeah.
If he was in Chicago today and had come to Chicago today, if it would be the same. We had a whole lot of demonstrations of hostility. A church at 31st and King Drive changed the address of their church to 31st Street when South Park was changed to King Drive.
Yeah.
Because of the hostility between what were leading clergy people in the African-American community around the country.
Yeah.
And so that still says there was a great deal of hostility toward King. And I'm wondering, like 63 years later, since he wrote that letter from the Birmingham jail, now, what has changed in the ministry? We know not much has changed in the country from the viewpoints of the points made by King in the letter. Now, of course, there are changes we could point to, like we've had Obama for president, but then on the other hand, we've had a backlash to Obama. A backlash is an action that happens after an action that no one expected, to make sure that that action does not repeat itself.
You preach it already, Doc.
And so what we're living through right now is the same kind of backlash that the nation experienced when there was a backlash to all of the new Reconstruction rules that were put into place right after the Civil War. It's the same kind of thing. And so I'm concerned because I've always viewed the power axis in America as being the press, the pulpit, and the people.
Press, the pulpit, and the people. Yeah, I like that.
They're the ones with the power.
Absolutely.
Politicians are manipulated by the people and the pulpit.
Yeah. That's why they seek to get to our places of worship, because we know we have that pivoting factor.
Well, absolutely. We make a difference in both communities.
Absolutely.
But my concern is that in the initial letter, it was addressed to, I believe, 6 or 7 clergy.
Yeah.
And so the letter was not like it was written to the city council of Birmingham. It wasn't addressed to the politicians of Birmingham. It was actually in response to an open letter that these clergy people
Yeah.
had put in the Birmingham newspaper, suggesting what you referred to earlier, that it was untimely for him to be there, and it was unwise for him to be in Birmingham at that time. And that was the opinion of the clergy. And these clergy persons were called the moderate clergy. They were not the conservative ones. They were not the radical, all-out John Birch's and the White Citizen Society and the KKK people. They were considered the moderates. And they were saying that King was an outsider. It was an untimely time for him to be there, and it was unwise for him to be there. But understanding why there's some hostility, well, understanding that there was some hostility, I'm not sure I understand why. I'm not sure whether it was political opportunism that made pastors or ministers in the Chicago area not really come out to support someone who was making a difference around the country. And maybe we felt like the people in Birmingham that Chicago is not his city. So why are you in Chicago? Because they called him an outsider.
Sense of territorialism.
Right, and said he was an agitator. And we've experienced some of that, not just for the city. We have geographic territorialism inside the city. There's very little cooperation in terms of the West Side clergy and the South Side clergy or the East Side clergy, or not to mention interfaith interactions. It's pretty much just, paying some kind of tokenism. And so how do we get past that? I don't know, but I've always wondered why Baptists had a problem accepting a fellow Baptist pastor. Who was a real representative. For the clergy of America.
Absolutely. And that whole Birmingham letter, just coming back from Birmingham, from our National Baptist Convention inauguration, that it kind of, resonated different, especially we were in the birthplace of a lot of, segregation. Matter of fact, we were in the church that was bombed. Those little girls that
four little girls
that lost their lives, and to hear that letter again, and to see that many clergy were those clergy were being somewhat positioned to thwart the attempts of King's stance, and really not trying to help in push of equality. When you read that letter, it changes the whole dynamic of how you think. And when you were saying about even as Baptist clergy or even in the city, I didn't recognize coming to Chicago to pastor how segregated we are in certain territories, And I think that if we come together to really acknowledge that we as pastors are supporting people who are dealing with issues on a day-to-day basis, such as what King was addressing, and just moving away from the geographical territorialism, we can pool together our resources, our minds, and our strengths to try to address it, rather than just being complicit.
I think it's important. In the age going forward, and in what I call the age of retribution, retaliation, and the era of the backlash continues. Most of the advocacy of the most recent campaign for the highest office in the country was based upon conservative ideals that really take us back to the 50s and the 60s. And so the whole concept of making America great cannot be in retrospect. It has to be our greatness is in our future.
Absolutely.
And not behind us.
Absolutely.
if we don't believe that what lies ahead of us is greater than what lies behind us, and we need to go back to be great, then we're going to have a serious issue.
Amen.
And a serious problem. Well, let me ask this question. This document was obviously vilified by the white church, the white clergy in Birmingham. And I guess my concern is why, or do you believe from your own perspective and your own experiences that the viewpoint and perspective of the white Christian community is pretty much the same as that of the ministers back in 1960? Wow.
I believe so. I believe so. And I think even in the ministry of Jesus the Christ, he was vilified for speaking this kind of truth to power. I think that we've gotten to the point and place, and some of our clergy counterparts are trying to suggest that salvation remedies racism. As long as we preach Jesus, as long as we preach redemption, all of a sudden, no one would ever have those particular viewpoints, when the truth of the matter is many of our great theologians that we've studied from in seminary, Bible college, some of them had racist, bigoted viewpoints. And I think it was Dr. Matt King Carter that says that sometimes this kind of letter and the preaching of social justice, he says, causes them to really confront the private attitudes of their parishioners. And sometimes it's hard to confront those attitudes because they've been surreptitious and secretive, but they emerge in different ways through preaching that goes against social justice and so forth. So I think that we're seeing some of that even today, if I could say that.
Well, I tend to agree with that position. Well, we will all
it is what it is,
definitely get in trouble. But I tend to agree with you that beyond that, I have seen a lot of repercussions in the white Christian community to people, for instance, who gave support, voice support during the George Floyd protests around the country.
Yeah.
There were a number of Southern Baptist churches that actually threw their pastors out of prominent churches.
Absolutely.
Because they were speaking in favor of fair treatment and saying it was murder on the news when you saw the policeman's knee on this man's neck.
Yeah.
And they were thrown out of their congregations by a vote.
Yeah.
And so I am wondering whether it's the sheep like the shepherd or the shepherd like the sheep. Because I understand that most of the congregation does not have an opportunity to meet with politicians. They don't have a chance to tell the politicians what are their preeminent priorities in terms of the policy initiatives they expect them to legislate if they become elected. Those are all meetings with the leadership. During the Bush years, those people were called, the clergy leadership was called his kitchen cabinet. Bush's kitchen cabinet, the people he met with in his kitchen and get their opinions about what things he should initiate from the religious community. And my only thing that really annoyed and agitated me in the depths of my spirit was, why is it you could watch any religious program during the George Floyd protest on TV and not know that there were millions of people out in the street every night and around the country because there was not a church, there was not a pastor with prominence or significance on TV who addressed the issue that was on the street. They never even talked about it when the current executive was interested in using helicopters to scare the protesters off of the streets of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
There was no word from the Christian community or from the clergy at the top. And my concern is, how are we ever going to do what many people have worked on, Dr. Perkins and others, Brian Laritz, Tisby, and other authors who are writing about the impossibility of reconciliation between people who had the same God? How are we ever going to bridge this gap if we have a challenge where the white church does not even appear to see the immorality of racism or even admit that racism is a sin? I would offer a significant compensation if I had it, to anyone who could convince or introduce me to a significant religious leader who would say racism is a sin.
Yeah.
If racism and hatred is not portrayed as a sin, it's easy to follow the people you should be leading.
Yeah.
And that's what I tend to see. And I'm wondering, how do we bridge this gap? I mean, you are a leader of local churches. Your association has how many churches involved in the New Era, Greater New Era Association?
We have 80 plus churches in our association.
80 churches in the association. That's only one association, correct?
Correct.
In the city?
Yeah, out of 4 to 5 or more, well, 4 in Baptist General State of Illinois, and then
there's another state convention,
United Baptist Convention.
Right, and they've got how many churches?
Districts, I could say off the top of my head, maybe 6 or 7.
Not just local.
Yeah, not just local. Yeah.
How do we change the priorities and the focus? And I think maybe when we say words or use phrases like civil rights, that we alienate some people, because all of a sudden, if you say civil, they start to believe it's strictly
Black folk.
No, political.
Yeah, political, yeah.
They think it's strictly political and that the church should have no engagement or involvement in politics. But if the people say they are saved, then God just doesn't save you for Sunday morning sanctuary. He saves you for every choice you make, for every action you take. He saves you for every decision you make, every prejudice you have, every pre-thought you have about the lack of the inferiority of an individual. Last time I checked, Revelation says there is a heavenly stenographer who's making notes of our thoughts, our idle thoughts.
Yeah.
And so there is no space for me to have a separate conversation about my interaction with you based on your race and not based on my Christianity. And where we are now is that we've had this letter with us and we have not been challenged. The church refuses to accept it as a challenge. And I'm believing that we're going to have pastors and ministers who are on a reconciliation agenda to believe that it's important to confront our friends and our cohorts who are on the other side of the aisle based on their racial identity.
Yeah. And I think that's what I kept hearing, that what you kept saying. There's going to have to be a healthy confrontation where we get them to recognize that this problem is still here. It's still, being transparent. And even, and you can help me, you're a great theologian, Doc. When we look at the gospel according to St. Luke, Luke one who presents Jesus as the Son of Man, who was one who dealt with the sinners, the publicans, and the outcasts.
Right, right.
And some would label that as a gospel of liberation, to see that Jesus was concerned about those who were, in poverty, those who were placed in positions of the looked over, the downtrodden. I'm just asking you this as a young pastor, if we're going to have this confrontation in trying to bring reconciliation, how do we do that, but remain stable in who we are and what we believe, and not, selling out,
Well, I think it's critical, one, that a lot of our pastors need to be introduced to the empowerment document referred to in the scripture as the prophecy of Amos. I believe that Amos is a paradigm, a perfect example of the kind of an individual that every pastor who has concern, not just about who he preaches to, but about the lives of those people once he gives them the benediction on Sunday. And I think that is the issue. We've tried to find a distinction between what I say on Sunday and what happens to the people after church on Sunday. Because most of the people who are suffering from the policies or the lack of interest and concern of the people who have the power in our communities are our congregation.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And we tend to be the most silent, even though these are the people who support the lives, the lifestyles, the scholarships, the colleges.
Yes, sir.
That our kids attend. These are the ones who make it possible. And we tend not to care about what happens to them enough to stand up as the public moral critic and say to oppressors the same thing that Moses said: let my people go.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we've been paid to shut up.
Yeah.
On the first day, one of the most significant executive actions taken by the incoming executive on Pennsylvania Avenue was the dismantling of DEI, diversity,
quality, inclusion.
inclusion,
Yes, sir.
And equity. Yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
Of course, conservatives and the incoming president have decided that the D stands for divisiveness, that the E stands for exclusion, and the I stands for indoctrination. That white people are being indoctrinated against, and they've been greatly harmed because one of his greatest advisors suggests that nobody has been discriminated more in this country against than the white people in America.
My Lord.
That is the mantra that they are moving on beginning on yesterday, which is why every office, every government office funded to ensure that DEI was a functioning principle at every major corporation. They were all closed down yesterday. An executive order was signed that the budget will be emptied because, and this is the reason, it said that DEI divided the races in America. And it's money wasted. Now, the last time I checked, when we came to America, the races were already divided. We would go into the back door to get our water, to get our sandwiches, to get our hamburgers. We couldn't go to the movie. We had to sit in the balcony if we got in.
Yeah.
The only reason there's a separate church is because we got tired of sitting in the balcony.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah.
We couldn't even hear Jasper preach in the sun do move.
Yeah. Couldn't even go to the movies.
So all of these things are because the country was divided. So how could a policy that tries to even the playing field be the thing that divides the country? I have decided that one of the consequences of what has transpired over the past 3 months since before the election to this date has been that a whole lot of people miss the democracy argument as a part of the campaign because white privilege trumps democracy. No pun intended.
You just said them out.
You don't need democracy if you're a certain color, because you already got all the privileges that democracy ensures other people besides yourself.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And so you can afford to see democracy go as long as there's privilege for people who look like you. So that's why a whole lot of people didn't buy into these people are dangerous for democracy argument, because they said, well, I'm the right color, it won't bother me. Democracy is for the people who are fighting to get it. We've always had equality.
Yeah. And I think that's why King said that in that letter when he talked about those situations where it doesn't really bother you when you can't take your daughter to the nearest amusement park. And I hope I'm not jumping ahead when he
No, you're not.
about,
No.
He said when your ancestors isn't swinging from trees and being drowned in fluid and things of that nature, as long as it doesn't affect you, then you can remain silent, because you have the privilege to get you in any situation. And one of the things that, if I may say this, Dr. Parsons,
help yourself.
Even when it comes to the preaching of the black clergy, some would suggest that our preaching is too emotional. It's too loud, it's too boisterous. But just listening at what you said, the fact that the black preacher has to experience after he leaves the pulpit he or she has to deal with the pain, the peril, and the perplexity of how we're just going to navigate through the terrain
Yes, sir.
of our society. We are able to really take in what the text actually has to say, because we know what it's like, we feel it. And so our celebration, our voice volume goes higher because we actually understand. We don't got that privilege, we know that we've been just really leaning on a God to support us in times like these. And so I tell any preacher, don't become disconnected from the suffering of your own personal situations, that you don't allow it to become implemented in your preaching on a Sunday morning, because we know what it's like to actually deal with that.
Well, it's so important. And so I believe, one, go back to answer your question.
Yes, sir.
We've got to use Amos as a model and a prototype for the kind of men and women that God needs preaching the gospel today.
Yeah.
And leading churches.
Absolutely.
I think, secondly, one of the challenges we have now is that many people who lead huge congregations of people who look like us are people whose theological training was from schools that are actually run by, and the theological perspectives are presented for the preservation of the people who run the school.
Say it again, Doc, please.
And so how can we have people, even though they reflect a great deal of intelligence, if your theological perspective is that there's no place for the intersectionality of social conduct and spiritual ethics? There's no place for the preacher telling me I'm wrong for mistreating my black neighbor. He's out of place if he tells me I'm wrong for being a racist or being prejudiced. I'm wrong for wanting my kids to go to a school where everybody looks like them. And so that's the challenge that we have. And so I think it's so important that we've got to change, one, the training for our people. And when I say our people, I mean, one, those who lead people cannot be afraid to speak in the defense of the people you lead. If you won't defend your sheep, I mean, it's a poor shepherd who won't look out for his own sheep.
leading them to the slaughter.
It was the doctrine of the 23rd Psalm suggests that we have a different responsibility.
Absolutely.
You know, you got to feed them. You got to tend to their thirst. You got to present everything you need.
Got to deal with their wounds, Doc.
For their wounds. You know, you got to be able to anoint their head when they hurt.
Yes, sir.
You got to be their therapist. And there's no greater life coach than Jesus.
Yes, sir.
And we're not presenting that. But I think the training, the theological training is an issue because we have a whole lot of people who lead our churches who were not trained by folk from our own community. And so there's been no sensitivity, not even in their theological training, about the social dynamics of the culture because the people who taught them were not people who were familiar with their culture. They were giving them the same gospel that served them well. And you mentioned earlier that some of the forebearers of many of these institutions and seminaries, but just as recent as 2 or 3 years ago, there was a great break with all the seminaries of the Southern Baptist Convention where they all decided when they protested in Nashville about the naming of an auditorium for someone who had been a slave owner and a slave holder on the seminary grounds. And 6 Southern Baptist Seminary presidents met and voted that they were not going to change that name because this guy, though he was a slave owner, was a good person.
Yeah.
That's like, you know, good people on both sides in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
There are no good slave owners.
No, that don't even go on the side.
How can you be a good person and you think it's okay to own people?
Yeah.
Would it be okay for somebody to own you?
Yeah. But exactly, until it happens to you.
Well,
yeah, you know.
I've always wondered how we do that.
Yeah.
So how do we explain to our kids and the youth and a whole lot of young people, a lot of young whites have left the white church because they refuse to confront. But yet over 80% of evangelicals gave their vote to the conservative candidate who says out loud what his spiritual perspectives are. I've never had one thing I need to ask God for forgiveness for. But this is the role model who speaks in white churches to white youth. And yet we have issues and challenges when people who have positions like this, who look like us, if they're radical positions, then we have to disassociate ourselves.
Yeah. We've seen it happen on many occasions. Yeah.
You invite Farrakhan. When I'm probably the only Baptist preacher in Chicago who ever invited Farrakhan to his church. And he came and spoke. But I got a lot of flack for that.
Wow. What year was that in?
Oh, man. That was right after Reverend Jackson. I hosted Jesse when he came back from Syria, picking up Goodman. And everybody maligned him and said he had no business going because he wasn't a politician. And the whole concept of the letter was, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Yeah.
And so we cannot be silent. We cannot be territorial. If you don't believe that you should only preach in Chicago, why should you only talk about what's wrong in Chicago? If you're going to be territorial, when you call for a revival in Detroit, tell them you can't come because you don't live in Detroit. You don't know how to preach to the sinners in Detroit.
Yeah, yeah.
Or if you get another call to come preach in Birmingham, tell them you can't come because. But that's not our perspective.
No.
You take the gospel everywhere. And a part of the gospel is love your neighbor as yourself. A part of the gospel is, hey, don't forget, join us next week. Now, this conversation is going to continue, and we're going to continue to talk about how we deal with these challenges from the perspective of the pulpit, the African-American church and community, all supporters of influence, and people who believe that Dr. King had a valid viewpoint, that it was not heresy, that it was filled with the gospel message, and that his truth and his letter and the context and the content was biblical in its perspective and presentation, and that his words were prophetic. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Jarvis HANSON, for being my special guest today. And I hope you're going to stay tuned after this podcast, because you're going to meet a spectacular young lady named Loveland Parsons. Loveland is going to have a podcast, and Loveland is 4 years old, but once you meet her, you won't believe it. So stay tuned for that as well. Hey, God bless you. Thank you for being a part of us today. Thank you, Dr. HANSON, for being my first guest, man. I'll never forget you.
Thank you for
Hey, God bless you. And thank you, WVTC. Be sure to download the app. Tell all of your friends about it. It's available on 8 different streaming platforms. You want to be a part of this movement, this network that's going to meet the needs of your family for entertainment, inspiration, motivation, and information. God bless you. See you next week.
Bless you.